So to summarize this kind of evisceration of the corporation as we knew it, you point to two trends. One, which is how corporations become something different. And there the Trojan horse is this agency theory that supposedly to save the profitability of corporation says that a corporation should be about maximizing shareholder value for the shareholders. But in fact, this is less about salvaging the corporation that is overregulated in the late Fordist era or even threatened, but it is really something that will completely transform what the corporation is. So that's what happens on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you have these sort of private investors who eventually, or private entrepreneur, who eventually go public, but they go public while retaining the structure of their private capital. So this is how this double ascendancy of patrimonial capitalism occurs. But the other thing that you point out, which is I think crucial, is the fact that what gets lost in all that is the interest that capitalists have in what used to be called profit. In other words, the fact that you sell at a higher price than the cost of producing commodities. That form of profitability, which was the ideological motive of all these reforms, goes pretty much out the window because now it is about capital gains and even more unrealized capital gain. So in a way, it's the credit of the company rather than its profitability that becomes the essential part. Okay, so that's what happens at the corporate level, and you mentioned already how it's going to be in a relation of symmetry with the political, with the unitary theory and the Trump mutual fascination with these new moguls. But practically, how does the Republican Party will become the vehicle of this neo-patrimonial capitalism? In other words, how will the Republican Party will succeed in harnessing them? You can see why they have affinities, but what was like the wedge that allowed it?
Firstly, I might respond to some of your comments because I just got some new ideas there. So they're still interested in profit, right? It's just a different profit form. Okay, so we've gone from so-called industrial profits, there must be a better word for that, to capital gains. And, capital gains is the profit form that is characteristic of private equity and other private investment funds, primarily business partnerships, under New Deal securities law. So that is their kind of trademark profit form. So again, when I say capital gains becomes important for everyone, even corporate leaders, that's where you see that it's almost as if the model of the business partnership, the limited liability company or the limited partnership gets translated into the corporation or gets internalized into the corporation so that it becomes something other than itself, even when on paper it's a listed corporation. The second thing, yes, this idea of the eclipse of the corporation that agency theorists were celebrating in the 1980s when they were talking about leveraged buyout firms, I think by many has been read as a kind of celebration of this idea of shareholder democracy. And shareholder value ideology gets conflated with that. But I think there are a lot of different constituencies feeding into that moment, okay? And I guess making use of the leveraged buyout boom for their own ends. And when you look closely at agency theory, so the work of Jensen and Meckling and Eugene Farmer as well, they're not interested in corporate democracy at all. Even though they claim to be writing in the tradition of the great New Deal theorists of the corporation, Burl and Means, Jensen and Meckling are doing something very different because they almost want to reverse back to the Gilded Age situation that Burl and Means were critiquing. Okay, so when you look closely at what Jensen and Meckling are actually doing, when they're talking about the agency problem of the firm, this kind of mismatch of incentives between the professional manager and the shareholder, for them, that problem is resolved in one type of firm in particular. And it's the privately owned firm, it's the private investment fund, it's the limited partnership, it's the sole proprietorship. Why do these firms have no agency problem? Because the shareholders are the owners. The founders control the firm. The family are the shareholders. So they actually have a very romantic vision, and in fact, their ideal firm is the closely held, privately owned, family-run firm. They even mention the Pritzkers, the big corporate raiders, the various dynasts of the time. And I think it's interesting because these texts are so influential and such a reference point. But I think people almost kind of skate over these passages because they think the defense of private equity in these texts must be all about the introduction of some greater kind of corporate democracy, greater voice for the shareholder. And in fact, what these people are about is saying that private equity is good because there is no democracy. Okay? These are private forms that are highly autocratic because the owner is the shareholder. Okay? And so I think what they're anticipating is this process by which the norms of the private equity firm and the unincorporated private family-owned company become generic, become ubiquitous, and almost come to define the corporation in general. So there's that, and I thought I should mention where the term patrimonialism comes from. So I take it from Weber. I don't think I'm a Weberian. I don't have any kind of fealty to that, but I do find it very interesting the fact that he's using this ideal type of patrimonial capital in contrast to what was thought already to be the ascendant form of capitalist organization, which was the managerial corporation. And he's not sure whether this is quite capitalist or not. He's talking about patrimonial capitalism, but he's not sure whether they're quite compatible. And if you look at the mainstream of business history in the 20th century, the argument is always that the time arrow of economic modernization is moving away from the family-owned patrimonial form to something to a structure where there is widely dispersed ownership, and where the manager is really someone quite exchangeable. They have no personal affiliation to the firm, and certainly their income is not porous with the income of the firm. Okay, so Weber has this phrase, in the patrimonial firm, the office is inseparable from the household. Okay, so personal wealth is inseparable from the wealth of the business. And there is general consensus in the 20th century business literature that this is a thing of the past. And in fact, when business historians are extolling American capitalism, when they want to explain why American capitalism is so much more vivacious and innovative than European capitalism, it's because the Europeans still have these big family firms, and the Americans have transcended that. They've moved towards something that's much more impersonal, that's much more democratic, if you like, and that's much more professionalized. Okay, so you can see why Weber, writing at the beginning of the 20th century, would think, well, is patrimonialism even compatible with capitalism? It's odd because he came from a big business dynasty family, so this is probably why he was chewing over it. What I find interesting is that there's a kind of echo. It's almost as if there's an internal reference within his work, a kind of internal historical reference, and that is his doctoral thesis, which is this quite compressed, very short, very straight history of the limited partnership or the partnership as business form. Okay. So the partnership as distinct from the modern corporation. Okay. And the partnership has a very different history. Some people trace it back very, very far. He traces it back to early modern Italy, and he says that the partnership is distinct in that the business relations here are kin-like. They're kind of convertible into kin relationships. And they're business forms that take a kind of household form. So it doesn't have to be a biological kinship relation, but you have networks of business partners, brothers. Okay, it's a kind of an adoptee relationship. It's exclusively male. Okay, so these are fraternities. And they constitute these business households in which the income of the household also becomes, the income of the business also becomes their family income. So there's a kind of inheritability to that income. So when you look at the history of the partnership, this remains quite constant. I mean, the general partnership actually is a family business, but limited partnerships are a little bit more elastic. They can bring in people from outside the family, but nevertheless, it's as if the horizontal kinship relation between brothers still dominates and stamps these business relationships. And that remains true even into the 20th century. You know, a lot of the early private equity firms are brothers or cousins. I'm trying to remember, KKR, I think, they're cousins. They come from an oil family. You'll often find these kinship relations in limited partnerships. So where am I going with this? Yeah, so I think what happens with private equity is that the way it evolves from the 1980s onwards is that it's still a partnership firm, but there is a moment where it becomes legally possible for these partnerships to draw in immense amounts of capital from institutional investors. So they're partnerships, but they start to be able to access the same kind of capital base as corporations. Okay, so that kind of difference in scale between the corporation and the partnership disappears. I mean, it's embryonic in the 1980s, but I think now what we're looking at is a situation where you look at some of these big tech corporations, and it's almost as if there's a private equity firm hidden within. You know, it's kind of embalmed within. And so it's very difficult to draw the line between the classic patrimonial form of the partnership and the corporation today. And there's actually a law and economics scholar, Larry Ribstein, who has this, quite an inflated thesis about the superiority of the partnership because it's this kind of household patrimonial form, and the way in which he sees it as having cannibalized the corporation in the early 21st century.